It's been about 10 years since the last One Star album, or actually, it's been more than 10 years, so it's about time for a new one. Let's dive in. Revel in Time by One Star. So One Star is the kind of side project of Arjen Anthony Lucassen. And for those of you that don't know about Arjen's work, he is kind of also the brainchild of Arjen, with such prominent albums like The Human Equation, 010110001. I think I still got that one. But also like Enter the Electric Castle and all those, where it's just this massive conglomeration of like, it's like JCS, but for prog, right? And he kind of took that idea and that entity and also applied it to a lot of his other works. Now, he also has a few like straight up Arjen Lucassen projects like Enter the New Real, or I think it's The New Real. That one's one of my favorites. I freaking love that. If you haven't heard it by now, please do yourself a favor and go and check it out. It's an absolute masterpiece. So one of the things that Arjen really likes to do is kind of a foil to whatever he did last, you know? So like after he put out the big prog that was A Theory of Everything, that again I loved, he put out a little bit more of a subdued item of The Gentle Storm. Then he went right into The Source, which was this really heavy, metally powerhouse of an album. And then going into his last one of Transitus. Wasn't a big fan of Transitus. Still not. It was a little bit more of a kind of a rock opera than a prog piece. And I think he should have labeled that more as a Arjen Lucassen like side project rather than an Arjen project, because it doesn't quite feel like an Arjen project. And I know that was kind of the original idea. So that's a lot of context for coming into this. But what I wanted to really iron out is that this, again, is another foil to Transitus. So where Transitus was this sprawling story, this gothic tale of star-crossed lovers that meet a Romeo and Juliet fate, and while in death, this character is finding out and has to solve how they died, who killed them, what happened in that, and so it was very focused on the vocals and on the lyrics and on the singers. So there was a plethora of guest appearances in terms of singers. On here, we still kind of have that because there's quite a number of guest stars on this to provide their vocals for each track, but it's not quite as focused driven. This one is much more focused in on the actual music that's on this. And before I get into that overall music, like all of the One Star albums, because there has to be an like a concept coming into this, this one is again a very loose concept album in that it doesn't follow a narrative story, but what it does do is each track tackles a different movie, or at least a different media. And this is something that One Star has done right from the inception of the band. You know, the first One Star album of space metal was all about films that were inspired by being out in outer space, you know, so like Alien and all those tracks. And then the second one that came out 10 years later, of Victims of the Modern Age, are all tracks that are either like apocalyptic dystopian movies, kind of like A Clockwork Orange or Blade Runner or something like that, right? So this one is dealing with movies all about time travel and all about the concepts of time. And half the fun of all One Star albums is trying to parse out what movie they are singing about. And that's always been my favorite part of all One Star projects. And that's my favorite part of this one, was sitting down, getting entrenched, and obviously I haven't listened to every single movie out there or media, so there was a few that I wasn't familiar with, and I was continuously scratching my head of like, is it this one? Is it that one? Is it this one? But you know, I got like maybe about half of them before I cheated and, you know, looked them all up. But yeah, so that's kind of like the main star performer on here. What I also love is just how unified everything feels on this album. And I mean, you gotta give your hats off to Arjen. He knows how to follow through on a concept. All of these tracks feel very unified. They feel very thematically similar. At no point does it ever feel like it's retreading old ground or becoming redundant or just being derivatives of the ones that came past. Like each song brings something new to the table in the concept of the overall album and in the context of the music that's found around it. The music is the typical Arjen metal, that big symphonic metal. I love the chugging guitar works. I love the driving bass and drum styles on there. And in terms of musicians lending their, prowess to this, we've got Steve Vai, we've got Tony Martin, we've got Brittany Slayer, we've got Michael Romeo from Symphony X, which I friggin' love. Joe Lynn Turner from Rainbow and Deep Purple are on here, as well as Jeff Scott Soto from Sons of Apollo and Youngleen Malmsteen. Ooh, that's a fun one. But we also have some brilliant vocalists as well. The most prominent one, and the one that I know the most well, is Ross Jennings, from Haken and whatnot. And what I also really appreciate is this album comes in 2 discs, right? So you have the main disc that has most of the music that, it's the proper disc. But then we have the second disc of same songs, different singers, where it's either Arjen himself or some of the other musicians that he's palled around with quite regularly, providing all of the vocal works. And these were the tracks that were given out to the singers as like the samples of like, this is what we want to hear. So it's really interesting to see where those guest stars came on and made the song their own, put their own flavor or signature on it to really elevate the music overall. And I really appreciate the fact that Arjen actually did this, because it does provide a new context and conversation for all of these tracks. So very, very well done. So I know I've kind of talked around all these songs instead of actually talking about the songs themselves, but honestly, because each of these tracks feels so familiar to me at this point in Arjen's discography, it's kind of hard to talk about each individual track without really talking about how they meet their maker in terms of like where the source material came from. And I don't want to give too much away, because as I mentioned, half the fun of this album is finding out what track matches what movie. And the one thing that I really do love about this album is, even though time travel is the overall mythos of all these, each of the movies that the album is going for, time travel is kind of like the plot device, and it's really the themes. It's the underlying connections that go with that. And I love the fact that Arjen has picked up on all of those and kind of like blended it into the tracks themselves. And without giving anything away, I love the fact that that happens, like the first track of The Fate of Man, even though the movie itself is a horror film, it's really the connections that the characters are feeling and the love that's found between them. I love that the second track of 28 Days Till the End of Time, it's really the darker undertones, and it's the teenage angst that the characters are feeling and how that bleeds into this gut punch once you find out of all this time travel aspects of it. I love the fourth track of Back from the Past is just goofy and fun and ridiculous, and like the actual premise, when you sit down and think about it, is just bonkers and ridiculous. But the music that's found around it reflects this and takes that into account. And same with the title track of Revel in Time. If you think about it right on paper, the movie itself is just bonkers and ridiculous. But it's the found family. It's the ties within these characters and what they go through and how they grow from their experiences that is blended very well with the music that is found on there. As well as today's Yesterday, the 8th track. And I love how, upon first listen, you're like, oh man, this guy must be a serial killer going out there and like being crazy the whole time, until you realize what movie they're referencing and you're like, oh, okay, no, that kind of makes sense. But talking about some of the more heartfelt and really like moving ones, Bridge of Life and the last track of The Lost Children of the Universe, those two are just gut-wrenchingly beautiful, especially with Lost Children of the Universe. I know that the movie itself is very divisive. I love the movie that this is coming from, so hearing the interpretation of this, especially being the longest track at over 9 minutes, it's brilliant. And I mean, I own the actual soundtrack, and I love how Arjen is taking movements and themes from the soundtrack and putting it into the track itself. Revel in Time was a great treat. I still feel, even though I've given it so much praise, I do feel as though this album is a little bit of a safe bet for Arjen. I mean, most of the Star ones are, and it's not trying to be anything that it isn't. I mean, they're basically just love letters to films that Arjen loves, and for that, he succeeded with flying colors. I feel like since The Theory of Everything, Arjen has found a very safe box to play in, and he loves it, we love it, and he doesn't really need to experiment all that much. So for another like younger hungry band or even older bands where I would have probably pinged this as a negative, and I have in past reviews of his work, but for this one, because he's not trying to do anything all that new or drastic or all that, and really at the end of the day, he's just writing a love letter to all these movies, I can't help but love it. I can't help but have a good time. Even though I will also admit, he has done much, much better than this. But that's fine. That's fine. He doesn't have to write a masterpiece every single time. I found myself enjoying it, and I had a good time with it. I probably won't be returning to this as often as I have his other works, but it was still a good time. So yeah, in the end, I will say that Revel in Time was a great time. I had a lot of fun with it. It was a very unique experience, as all one-star albums are. But if you've heard the first two and you've heard and been enthralled with Arjen and all of Arjen's past works, you know exactly what you're getting with this album. And he met my expectations exactly where I laid them. So I can't fault him for that. So I will say that Revel in Time by Star One, yeah, it's one that I would absolutely download. As I mentioned, it doesn't break the mold in any way. It doesn't do anything that it doesn't set out to do. It knew the assignment, it completed the assignment, and it gets a solid thumbs up for me. And yeah, if you're a fan of Arjen's work, you're going to have a good time with it. It's just, far and away from his best. Oh boy, it's so hard to kind of talk about things like this where I had a great time, but I still recognize that this is far and away from his best work. But there you go. There you go. There's my review of Revel in Time. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you have just as much fun as I did? Did you cheat and look at what movies these were in relations to before sitting down and listening to it? I will, as I mentioned, I eventually broke down with some of those, and I'm like, okay, I've never heard of this. I haven't watched this. I don't know what this is in reference to. So there you go. There you go. Let me know all of that by commenting down below. And yeah, that's all I got. That's all I got. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.